I'm John Pinero, Director of Research at Acton Institute. I'd like to welcome you to this special Acton Lecture Series. Today, this Acton Lecture Series is part of a conference, an academic conference running all day here in the building called Character, Commerce, and Human Flourishing. That's a conference sponsored by the Journal of Markets and Morality and the Bush School of Business at Catholic University of America and the Ciceronian Society. And I just want to, if I don't remember to tell you later, you're welcome to stay afterward if you'd like to stay and hear some of those paper presentations throughout the rest of the day. Again, thank you for joining us. The format will be a 30-minute lecture followed by 30 minutes of question and answer. We are live streaming this lecture, and during question and answer, I just ask you to please wait for the microphone to be passed to ask your question. Since we are recording, that also helps people hear. I'd like to give a special welcome also to those watching online. There are two online watch parties, one in Portland, Oregon, and another at Belmont University. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Andrew Abela is the founding dean of the Bush School of Business, professor of marketing, and former provost of the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He is also a faculty affiliate at Harvard University's Human Flourishing program. His research has been published in several academic journals and in 3 books. He is a frequent speaker on business ethics and cultivating the superhabits of success in organizations. Prior to his academic career, Dr. Abela was a brand manager at Procter Gamble, management consultant with McKinsey Company, and managing director at the corporate executive board, now Gartner. He holds an MBA from the Institute for Management Development in Switzerland and a Ph.D. from the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia. He and his wife, Kathleen, live in Great Falls, Virginia, and have been blessed with 6 children and 2 grandchildren. I'd also like to point out Dr. Abela is a past Michael Novak Award winner from the Acton Institute. Will you please welcome Dr. Abela?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm in good company at the Bush School of Business. There are 3 of my colleagues who are also Novak Award winners from the Acton Institute, so there's 4 of us in total out of 24 faculty. That's 3 more than any other business school in the world, as far as I can tell. So it's part of our hiring policy. So did you win an award from Acton? All right, you're in. So in the last years of the 19th century, Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum was a response to what people back then called the social question. So the social question was, quote, the most pressing question of the day, and it was the question of how do you deal with the massive upheaval and dislocation caused by the replacement of workers with machines. Our current Pope chose the name Leo because he saw the same question arising again. How are we going to deal with the anticipated upheaval caused by the replacement of workers, this time with intelligent machines or AI, artificial intelligence? The underlying question is the same today as it was back then, which is, are employees factors of production or human beings with a dignity that should be respected? And the answer, of course, has to be both, because they are human beings, so they have to have their human dignity respected, but they are hired for the purpose of creating value, and so they have to be economically viable. There's a sort of zero-sum view that puts these 2 in tension. So in the sense that the more you pay employees, the less money is left for shareholders. But that's, I think, a very simplistic view, because we know in many, many cases where investing more in employees actually provides greater returns to shareholders so that both are winning. And in fact, throughout the 20th century and into our own, there have been several noteworthy attempts to show how treating employees well can also be good for shareholder value. So if I start with the work of Elton Mayo back in the 1930s, the bunch of research that we now remember as ending up in what was called the Hawthorne effect, a bunch of research on factory plants. That research has been critiqued in more recent years, but the substance of it remains, which is concluding that the more you pay more attention to employees, they become more productive. In the 1950s, we had Frederick Hertzberg and his colleagues published a book called The Motivation to Work. Similarly, some similar findings that meaningful work leads to greater productivity. In the 60s, Rensis Likert, who gave his name to the Likert scale, published something called New Patterns of Management, presenting extensive evidence that employee-centered managers get more productivity out of their teams. And then in the 80s, the still famous In Search of Excellence from Peters and Waterman, and its focus on productivity through people. In the 1990s, Jim Collins and Jerry Porras's book Built to Last emphasized the importance of purpose at work. And Stanford professor Jeffrey Pfeffer published The Human Equation, where he synthesized a wide range of empirical research to show the business benefits of putting employees first. In the 2000s, we had Collins coming back with his book Good to Great, and a focus in part on what he called level 4, or humble leadership. And Raj Sisodia and his colleagues with the disarmingly titled Firms of Endearment about the business impact of genuinely caring for your employees. And then even more recently, Laszlo Bock, who was Google's head of people operations, his book called Work Rules, based on extensive empirical research within Google itself, showing the link between, on the one hand, employee autonomy, trust, and meaning, and performance on the other hand. I want to emphasize, every one of these books is based on extensive empirical research. There are many, many other books that are more like wishful thinking. Wouldn't it be nice if, or works of moral philosophy, which is we ought to. But these are actual kind of empirical studies showing that when you treat people well, the business fares better. So across almost a century, you would say, of management research, and there's several other more recent academic studies as well, a clear positive relationship between employee flourishing and business outcomes. So overwhelming evidence that practices like providing meaning and purpose, so that work serves something greater than self for the employee, treating employees, respecting their human dignity, treating them not simply as means to an end, providing autonomy in work, and leading with service and humility lead to better business outcomes. Interestingly, these 4 same principles line up with the 4 principles of Catholic social doctrine: the common good, human dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity. So we've empirically discovered the normative guidance of the social doctrine. Given all this evidence, these are my 2 big questions that I'd like to address today. Given all this evidence that employee-centered management leads to better business results, how come it is all still so rare? So we know that managing for human flourishing works, and that there are many companies across different industries that do that. For example, the companies that show up year after year in Fortune's top 100 best places to work. But they're a minority. The majority of companies don't seem to do this. My evidence, Gallup's annual measure of workforce engagement. It's a measure of how much employees are into their work, if you will, versus being disengaged, is this year comes in at 31%. Across the 25 years, lest you think that this year is an anomaly, across the 25 years that Gallup has tracked workforce engagement, it's never been higher than 36%. So year after year, just around a third of employees are engaged, almost 2/3 of employees not engaged in their work, not flourishing. These are US numbers. The international numbers are even worse, closer to 20%. So why is it? Why, despite incontrovertible evidence that human flourishing at work leads to better business results, is there so little human flourishing at work? We hear people who have studied this come up with different reasons, different findings, like leaders aren't paying enough attention to things like this and corporate culture. Managers don't have sufficient time. They're too busy to pay attention to these things. Incentives are misaligned, more short-term focused perhaps. All of which, it seems to me, is another way of saying that business leaders aren't making flourishing a priority. And since most business leaders say that they do value employee flourishing, then they're not really acting in accordance with those values. They value their employees, they value employee flourishing, but when faced with the day-to-day pressures of work, they don't live those values. There's something else going on as well, which has more to do with management theory than with the challenges of practice. And so with apologies to Yogi Berra, actually he didn't really say this, but it's such a good line, it's attributed to him, on the link between employee flourishing and business results, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? Here's what I mean. So 20 years ago, London Business School professor Sumantra Ghoshal died while drafting what would turn out to be a really important and widely cited paper. His son and some colleagues finished the paper. It was published under the title "Bad Management Theories Are Destroying Good Management Practices." The paper argues that much of modern management theory is built on supposedly amoral and pessimistic assumptions about human behavior like self-interest, utility maximization, opportunism, and so on. And that through what is called a double hermeneutic, these mistaken views influence management practice, which then further influences the theory. And more recent scholarship seems to affirm that Ghoshal's critique is still very relevant. So what seems to be happening here is that as long as we have a management theory that is not grounded firmly in an authentic understanding of human nature, but just some kind of abstraction or approximation that is narrowly utilitarian, whenever we try to add human flourishing into the theory or practices about human flourishing is in a sense they're kind of rejected by the theory as being foreign to it. They're foreign bodies, that don't belong in the theory. And so this stuff never sticks, despite years and decades of solid empirical support for it. So what we need to do, I think, is to rebed our management theories into a more accurate vision of human nature. So what would that look like? Here's the good news. In a number of disparate fields, both inside and outside of management, additional empirical research seems to be discovering independently the need for such a perspective, the need for a human flourishing perspective, and proposing a number of different approaches. So these include, for example, the large number of people now working in the field of positive psychology, originally rooted in the University of Pennsylvania's Positive Psychology Center. Nearby, there's a Center for Positive Organizations, which is not actually related. Accidentally, both chose the word positive. This is based in the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. Within the management field, but positive organizations research focuses on the link between human flourishing and business results. Centered around the leading business school in Canada, the Ivy School, Business School, is a group working on something called leadership and character, focusing on the implications of character and leadership and connection to flourishing. And then outside of the academy, there's a group called America Succeeds, which is a large not-for-profit organization focused on education. And they've been looking at the most in-demand employee skills. And then in business itself, both the firms of Deloitte and McKinsey Company have been doing work on important employee capabilities. These research streams, again, all empirical, are running in parallel and seem to me to be converging on the same thing, but they don't seem to be talking to each other very much or at all, in part because they're all using different terminology. What all of these different groups are studying are things like courage and gratitude and generosity and prudence and so on. Things we've been talking about, those in the academic conference all this morning already. But they call them different things. So positive psychology calls them character strengths. Positive organizations calls them positive traits. The character and leadership people call them leader character dimensions. America Succeeds calls them durable skills. Deloitte calls them capabilities. McKinsey calls them distinct elements of talent. Those are all kind of accurately descriptive, But it's only at very few places like the Virtue Ethics in Business program at the University of Navarre and at my own business school, the Bush School of Business, that we call them by their real name, which is the virtues, right? The virtues. So there's actually way more study of the virtues than you would realize with a simple Google search, because you'd be searching on the wrong word. Because the rest of these folks, for some reason, don't like the word virtue. And so they've been studying it under a different name. Now, lest you think, okay, we're back to talking about values. I did say virtues, not values. And there is an enormous difference between those two words, enormous and important difference. So values are ideas. Virtues are putting those ideas into practice. Values are talking the talk. Virtues are walking the walk. Values is saying, like, I value aviation safety. Virtue is, I know how to fly a plane. Maybe you still don't think there's that much of a difference. Subconsciously, I think, too many people think of virtues as external standards. When we talk about virtuousness, we think of it as matching this external standard. So courage and generosity and gratitude would be things we measure ourselves against. So I might do something and go, oh, that wasn't very generous of me, or that's not very grateful of me. But if that's the way we're thinking about it, we are missing absolutely the most important thing to know about virtue, that each virtue is not an external principle, an external measure, a standard to be measured against. It is an internal capacity that is helpful to think of as a mental muscle, something inside of us that gets stronger the more we exercise it. That the virtues are mental muscles that we all have, and that in fact need to be exercised to get stronger, and that the way to grow in a virtue is to practice it every day. If I want to become more courageous, I have to do little courageous things every single day. The most important thing, therefore, to know about a virtue is that it is a habit of excellence. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh dear, from the sublime to the ridiculous. We were talking about a grand theory of human flourishing in business, and now we ended up with atomic habits. And I could see why you might think that. Atomic Habits is a very good book. How many of you are familiar with this book? Yeah, every time I talk to people, 3/4 of people have heard about it. Some of them have bought it, some even have read it. Okay. It's a very good book about showing us how to cultivate habits by taking little, tiny, kind of bite-sized steps, tiny little bite-sized practices that you repeat every day. And it has, in fact, hit a very important note. Recent research concludes that habits are the most effective way for changing behavior. Ahead of education, ahead of telling stories, ahead of whatever your favorite behavior change mechanism is, habits are the most effective, according to at least one fairly large meta-analysis of a couple of hundred studies. So I think pretty robust finding. But I can see why you might be confused. So here's a question. How many of you, I'm not going to ask you, anybody's asked this in person, but just a show of hands, how many of you are currently or have recently tried to build a habit? Just show of hands? Okay, a lot of people. Second question, I'm just going to guess that the habit you're trying to build is one of these three: diet, exercise, or sleep. Am I right? Yes, right? Yeah, okay, there we go. Yeah. Nothing wrong with improving diet, exercise, or sleep. Very good for our health. But what would this have to do with successful people management in an organization? And this is, in fact, the problem, I think, with the whole habits movement. It tells you all about how to develop habits, but doesn't address the question of which habits are the most important to develop. It just leaves it whatever you want, but entirely up to you. And so we end up doing with habits of diet, exercise, and sleep. Again, nothing wrong with those, but they aren't the most important habits we could develop. We shouldn't stop with those. There are more important habits we could be working on. Diet, exercise, and sleep are what we share with the animals, right? Animals eat, animals move, animals sleep. Are there distinctive human habits, right? Habits that are distinctively human? And in fact, there are, and I'm following now Thomas Aquinas' treatise on the virtues in this way. So Aquinas explains that in our day-to-day living, everything that, this is Dr. Abela's interpretation of Aquinas. There's a Dominican here, so I want to be sure I'm precise in my not attributing things to Aquinas that he didn't actually say. So my interpretation, that everything that occupies us in our day-to-day living is one or more of these three things: our thoughts, our actions, and our feelings. So Aquinas is talking about intellect, will, and passions, but I'm just sort of simplifying here. Thoughts, actions, and feelings. These are distinctively human capacities, right? Animals don't think. Animals don't take deliberate action in the way human beings do. And while we can argue whether animals have feelings or not, those of you who have pets, you may think that they do. Research shows, for example, that when a dog appears to the owner to be expressing a feeling of guilt because the dog did something naughty and you're scolding the dog, I don't know how they conclude this, but they conclude that that's more in the mind of the owner than in the dog. Not sure how you would study that. But anyway, whether or not animals have feelings at that simple level, they certainly don't have the depth of emotion that human beings have, and they absolutely don't have the ability to master their emotions in the way human beings do. So the habits that lead to excellence in thought, action, or feeling are the distinctively human habits. They are the habits of human excellence that lead to excellence in our day-to-day practical existence. And I keep saying day-to-day practical because they don't include the kind of spiritual and intellectual habits that Aquinas also talks about, that I'm not discussing here. So what are these uniquely human habits? The uniquely human habit that leads to excellence in thinking in our practical day-to-day lives is called practical wisdom, otherwise known as prudence. But the word prudence, like so many words, including the word virtue itself, has sort of drifted a little bit in the general mind. People think of prudence as being sort of maybe scaredy cat a little bit, or a little bit reluctant to. I mean, you all know the true meaning of prudence. I like to use the word practical wisdom because it's clearer to the modern mind. It's the habit of making wise decisions, the habit of making wise decisions. And since most of our thinking in our day-to-day lives is for the purpose of making a decision, what shall I do, what shall I eat, what shall I say, what do I wear, where do I go, this is the virtue that perfects our day-to-day thinking. The habit that perfects our actions, the uniquely human habit, is the virtue of justice. It is the habit of treating everybody fairly and with respect for their human dignity. And then there are two other uniquely human habits that lead to excellence in dealing with our emotions. First, for the emotions of fear, emotions that are sort of repel us from things or situations or people, and that's the virtue of courage, also known as fortitude. This is the virtue not of not having fear, because fear is an emotion that just arises. It's not really controllable in that sense. Courage is the habit of moving forward despite being afraid. So it's how we deal with our fears. And then the opposite of the fears are our emotions of attraction, our desires. And the virtue there is self-discipline. The older word was temperance, but that too has drifted. Temperance now means in most minds only to do with alcohol, whereas traditionally temperance is really related to moderating our desires across all of our desires, so hence what we call self-discipline. Incidentally, if you ever wondered why are there four cardinal virtues, this is Aquinas' answer, right? And why are they so important? Because if you have these four cardinal virtues, then all of your thoughts, actions, and feelings are perfected, right? So this is what the virtuous human life looks like, is to be kind of effortlessly excellent in our thinking, in our action, and in managing our emotions. The problem, each of these four cardinal virtues is a very big habit that can take years to develop. Solution, Aquinas also identifies several smaller, what we'll call subsidiary virtues, or technically partial virtues, but they still have, most of them, the character of a full virtue. So for example, the virtue of practical wisdom has 8 partial virtues related to gathering information, reasoning through that information, and then turning your conclusions into action. I list 3 of them there. Judgment is one of those for gathering information. Reasoning is for reasoning. And then alertness is one of the virtues for making sure that you implement your decision effectively. It's the habit. So for Aquinas, a decision, practical wisdom encompasses a decision that's it's not properly made until it's actually implemented or acted upon. So alertness is the habit of maintaining situational awareness. so that if circumstances change that would affect how you would implement your decision, you'll know it quickly and you can pivot accordingly. This is often translated as circumspection, but again, that word has kind of drifted in meaning. I think alertness is a more accurate translation. So what does all of this mean if you're a manager or a business owner? What it means is it allows you to think about improving your business by working directly on this human core, on the virtues of your employees. So for example, if you're not satisfied with the level of strategic thinking in your organization, you can help your employees develop one or more of the virtues of practical wisdom by picking some kind of daily exercise that you would train them in and then have them do repeatedly. So I stay with the example of alertness. If you want them to grow in alertness, you'll encourage your employees to take, say, 10 minutes a day to check in with some important news sources for your industry or some industry contacts, perhaps, to see what's new that day. And if they do this every day, it becomes a habit, part of their routine. They are, in that sense, growing in the virtue of alertness, and through that, growing in the virtue of practical wisdom. Some people get surprised when I give this example because there doesn't seem to be a moral dimension with gathering information, say, and growing in alertness. And this is because I think we have too narrow a view of virtue as opposed to being only about moral excellence, whereas virtue is about human excellence in its totality, not just in the sort of right and wrong with respect to kind of what we think about as ethics. It's much broader than that. Okay, so similarly, if you wanted to improve employee relationships or customer relationships, you would want to help your employees grow in the virtue of justice. And particularly some of the subsidiary virtues of justice, which include things like generosity, gratitude, friendliness. These are all virtues that can be, like any virtue, cultivated through regular practice. If you want to encourage more innovation in your organization, you can help them grow in one or more of the virtues of courage, which include things like resilience and perseverance. And if you want to improve execution in your organization, then you want to focus on helping them cultivate the virtues of self-discipline. Aquinas actually identifies 15 of these, including, for example, diligence, orderliness, humility. When I talk to our students, explain this to them, and I say, if you're struggling with growing in self-discipline, now you know why it's hard. You're actually trying to grow in 15 different virtues at once. Don't do that. Just pick one. Start working on that. And it's kind of interesting that these virtues embody the kind of practices that promote human flourishing that I mentioned before, that a century of empirical research has shown leads to business success. So each of the cardinal virtues lines up with one of these common practices. So if we want to embed things like autonomy and leading with humility and so on into our organizations, we do that by cultivating the virtues among our employees. Perhaps most relevant for right now, these habits, these virtues, are exactly the lasting competitive edge that human beings have over machines, and especially over generative AI. Generative AI is getting better and better at knowing how to do things, and in many cases actually doing them for us through agentic AI. But there are two important things that only human beings can do, and I think only human beings will always only be able to do. So machines know how to do things, but they're not good at handling new and important decisions about what should be done. They don't have either the creativity nor the moral sense to do this. They're all trained on existing material, so they don't have the ability like us to kind of take those leaps forward, nor the moral judgment to decide what we can, what we should do. They're also not very good at checking themselves. So generative AI is by design a probabilistic algorithm, so it guesses the answer. And more it gets it right, but it has no way of knowing that it is right, because it's always a guess. But human beings, so we'll always be better at checking and making sure that things get done well. And so the virtues of practical wisdom and justice are the virtues for deciding what needs to be done. The virtues of courage and self-discipline are for making sure that the right things get done and done well. And so these four cardinal virtues are what are most human about us and what are most superior to machines in human beings. And therefore, if we want to navigate the challenge of AI and employment, it would seem to me that these are exactly the virtues that we need to be fostering among our employees. And this goes along with the fact that that also makes businesses more successful. So how do I put all this together? So there's extensive empirical evidence that shows that employee flourishing leads to business success, but a shortage of employee flourishing because managers don't appear to follow their stated values, their stated employee-centric values, in part because those values seem inconsistent with existing management theory. We can draw from positive psychology and positive organizations and all that other research to reground our management theory in virtue, recognizing that these different research streams are really all about the virtues gives us the foundations of a theory that we are looking for. And then the habits research gives us the practical mechanism for how to grow in virtue, say, in a work environment. So my proposal is that we work together to build out a unified theory of human flourishing in business grounded in virtue. What some of my colleagues at the Bush School are starting to call only half tongue-in-cheek free market Thomism. So the biggest problem to overcome, though, is finding a concrete set of the virtues, because even authors from the same tradition don't agree on the names or number of the virtues. Even if you're reading, say, for instance, within Orthodox Catholic writers, several really good books about virtues, you read them, every one of them gives you a different list of the virtues. Now, there's significant overlap, but they're different number and different which virtues are we talking about. And you might think, oh, why does that matter? Well, imagine we were doing chemistry, and every book you read had a slightly different periodic table of elements. You know, like this one has iron and sodium, the other one is kind of missing sodium, but it has magnesium. You know, it's like, how could you do chemistry that way? How can we do virtue if we can't even agree what the virtues are, you know? So all the different, so positive psychology, positive organizations, leadership and character, they all have their own sets of virtues as well, not calling them virtues. In every case, there's no pretense that they are complete. Positive psychology has 24, they've had 24 for 20 years, but they say we make no claims that this is a complete list because this is not a taxonomy, this is just a list. There is no taxonomy of the virtues in the entire universe other than the one that St. Thomas Aquinas developed in the Treatise on the Virtues. Different from every other group, every other writer, he doesn't just provide a list of the virtues, he provides a system that shows how all the virtues fit together and how his system is both complete and non-overlapping. So I think we should be grounded in that because it is the only one that makes that claim, and it's a claim that holds up very well. In my book, Superhabits, I sort of make a modest attempt to lay out that system of his, because it's not obvious reading the Summa that he's presenting a system. It looks like a list, but as you read it through, you realize that it is a complete system. So my book isn't an academic work, it's a popular work, but it is heavily footnoted or endnoted anyway, so that the academic apparatus is there, and I think it will be helpful in this effort. Some of you are familiar with the book and with my attempt to visualize Aquinas' system. We don't have time to go into it right now, but if you have the book, you have a copy of this as a fold-out poster in the back of the book, and if you don't, or if you do, you can download a copy of it through this QR code. That links you to my Substack, where there's a PDF, a copy of this. Feel free to take it and peruse it. So here's what I think we should do. For business leaders, should use the virtue approach I have described to strengthen their businesses. So whatever employee challenge you're facing right now, you figure out which virtue would help them overcome it, and then you take a little bite-sized practice and you get them to practice every day to do that. So I'm working with some companies to do this already. And then you let us know that you're doing it so we can write case studies about it. And then to the scholars in the room, write those case studies. And then let's strengthen the theory. Let's try to come up with a consistent taxonomy and consistent terminology. One author wrote that current empirical virtue theory is, quote, a patchwork of relatively disconnected studies of specific virtues based on ad hoc assumptions about those virtues. It's not exactly a science, right? We need to fix that and quickly. So at the Bush School, we're actually raising money for this effort, for this research, so stay in touch with us because we think it's really, really important. We have been very blessed in our fundraising. The school is only 12 years old. We've raised over $100 million for our work. So I'm optimistic that we'll raise the money we need to do this work. So, to sum up, the solution is for how to unify in a sustainable way human flourishing and shareholder value is to turn all of the great flourishing practices that research has identified into habits. But not habits of diet and exercise, habits like treating others with respect, leading with humility, alertness, and so on. In other words, the virtues. These are the habits on which pretty much every civilization prior to ours has been built. So we know that they work. So I shared with you this approach to human flourishing in business that itself leads to shareholder value. So it's a win-win, good for employees and owners, and will help us navigate the big AI transition. Let me just close with a little story. Many years ago, my wife was bringing home our kids, I think from the park or something, so she had them all in the minivan. I was coming home in a different vehicle bringing dinner. And the kids wanted to know, what is Dad bringing for dinner? My wife called me. I happened to be pumping gas at the time, and I said, I can't talk because I'm pumping gas. I don't know if you remember this, but we used to think that when you're pumping gas, the phone could spark and then you'd just blow up. Anyway, we thought that. So she hung up and she says to the kids, I couldn't talk to Dad because he was pumping gas, and when you're pumping gas and you talk on a cell phone, if the cell phone sparks, he would blow up. And little Monica, age 5, goes, oh no, then we'll never know what he was bringing for dinner. So here's what I want to say. If we don't pay attention to the human flourishing of employees, then it's like we care more about the dinner than who's bringing the dinner. So we got to do this. We know it works. We have to find a way to get virtue kind of back into business. I think we have the potential for a restoration of virtue in our land, led by business, if we do this right. Thank you very much. Did I leave us any time for questions? I know I ran over time a bit. So.
There's 2 microphones going around now. Please raise your hand for questions. We do have time, and please use the microphone.
Thanks, Dr. Abela. This was a fascinating talk. I have a question about the nature of virtue. So I appreciated your description of virtue as a habit. And for Thomas and for other important thinkers within the tradition of virtue, virtues are habits within a kind of metaphysical framework. And in particular for Aristotle, for example, and to some extent Thomas Aquinas, this is a teleological view of metaphysics, that virtues are the things that help us progress towards some kind of vision of a good life. And for Aquinas, that's human flourishing. And human flourishing is desirable because God desires human flourishing. So there is some kind of theological reason that we practice virtue. So there's some kind of ultimate value that virtue reaches towards. So I'm curious in terms of the implementation of virtue in business systems, if they need to have some kind of understanding of a teleological end goal or end point in order to adequately implement virtue into their political systems. To do virtue without the telos, is that to put the cart before the horse, potentially?
It's a good question. And related to the question of, can you do virtue for an instrumental reason, right? I think that's right, yeah. Here's the good news, and this is where our friends in positive psychology have really helped us. So Aristotle told us that the virtuous man is the happy man. Right? That living the life of virtue makes you happy. My parents used to tell me that virtue is its own reward, and I didn't understand that that's what they meant, and so I would think, well, that sucks. Kind of like the cartoon that you mentioned this morning, So the positive psychology have shown that as we grow in any one of the virtues, we actually become happier. So there's a fairly quick positive experience of growth in virtue. One that I like in particular is a study of growth in gratitude, where as you the test group keep a daily gratitude diary, which is a good way apparently of growing in the virtue of gratitude, and then they compare with the control group, and they improve in both in happiness and in mental and in physical health as well. It's astonishing. Growing in gratitude, you end up with reduced incidence of chronic pain, for example. They can't explain why. A theological explanation would be because you're living the way God designed you, so that everything's going to work better. But psychologists won't give us a theological reason. So the employees experience an immediate personal benefit from growing in virtue. And then I think it's Nancy Snow who makes this argument that experience of virtue is such that even if they didn't have a teleological reason, that feeling of flourishing is so positive that it's like, hey, I want more of this. That it is natural to us. And so when we start to live that way, it just gets better. So I'm not afraid of the kind of utilitarian criticism. It works, and I think the mistake, and there's a huge literature on virtue ethics. I hate that concatenate virtue ethics. I understand why we do that, but what we do when we talk about virtue ethics, we marginalize virtue as just another ethical theory. And that's what makes people think of it as just about morality rather than about human excellence as a whole. And so getting employees to start to cultivate the virtues helps them experience human flourishing, and then it just gets positive from there. Now, to be fair, the pagan virtue experiment ultimately fails, right? This is a theological argument that without grace, we're not able to really grow in virtue. We can make some progress, some strides, some significant strides, but you need grace to really fully grow in virtue. So there is that, but you can at least get started. And then we hope they get started and they say, what else can I do? Come to church, right? So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abela. This question is kind of a segue from the previous one, which is, for I think obvious reasons, your presentation focuses on the cardinal virtues. In the kind of the superhabits sort of scheme, do the theological virtues and Thomas's writings on the theological virtues fit in here? And if so, how so?
Sure. So oops. Can we bring the slide back? Well, no, probably not. But if you could bring the slide back just for a second, Dan. There we go. That's the one I want. If you look behind you, you'll see a slide. So Aquinas' system, the reason I think it is systematic, I know you can't read a word on the wheel, but you can see a series of concentric circles, right? And so what each of those circles, starting at the very the middle, the inside moving outwards, represents is a distinction that Aquinas makes. So in the treatise, he makes a series of progressive distinctions, finer and finer distinctions. The first one, and then he explains how each distinction gives you the domain of a set of virtues. So the first distinction is between the natural and the supernatural. So the supernatural would be the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. Then the natural, the next distinction is between intellectual and what he calls the moral virtues. I call them intellectual and practical, because by the moral virtues, he's talking about a practical everyday life. I did a little unintentional experiment at the Bush School. We had an electronic version of this where you could sort of click through this or that to follow Aquinas' logic to help the students find the virtue that they want to work on right now. And when we came to the distinction between intellectual and moral, almost everybody chose, I'm interested in an intellectual virtue. Nobody wanted to own up that I need to improve in morality. When we changed the word moral to practical, everyone went there. So words really matter, So distinction between intellectual and moral, or intellectual and practical. And then my book makes passing reference to the theological and the intellectual virtues. It focuses on the cardinal virtues, because I'm a dean of a business school. So I'm interested in sort of the everyday practice, and other brighter minds than me have written about the intellectual virtues and the theological ones as well. But they're absolutely necessary for flourishing, yes. Lest you misunderstand, yeah.
You mentioned that some of the existing models do not, that your theories here go against what are some of the prevailing models for businesses to operate under. Can you be specific? Are those things that come out of academia? Are they popular books by successful businesses? What are these other models that seem to ignore these principles?
They usually, almost always come out of academia. Books written by practitioners usually don't make this mistake. The ones that come out of academia suffer from what has been called physics envy. It's an attempt to try to reduce all of business phenomena to equations. And so we try to theorize and make mathematical equations out of human behavior. It's not just a problem with business, it's a problem with sociology. All of the social sciences run into this problem at one point or another. And so it's the notion that, so for example, we have big arguments about whether the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder value, because that's a nice thing you can reduce to equations. Well, of course, if you don't give the best return you can to your shareholders, they won't invest in you, But that's not simply reducible to an equation. If we did, we wouldn't need managers, right, or CEOs and so on. So it's the sort of reductionism and then we make assumptions about employees will behave always if left alone, they will cheat you, they will rob you, they won't work very hard, you have to monitor them, you have to, make sure the incentives are perfectly aligned. There's some truth to that, but as a foundational assumption, it leads us astray because it leaves no room, for example, for the kinds of things that all those different authors were suggesting and which do actually work in flourishing organizations. Does that make sense? Okay.
In the secular world, the secular business world, how do you deal with the spiritual slice of the pie there for faith, hope, and love? What would be the discussion there?
In the secular business world, well, there's a number of different approaches. I don't have a sort of comprehensive framework, so I'll just sort of enumerate different things that I've seen. Kind of at the simplest level, you have just personal piety. So just people understanding how to live the life of faith at work as well as, which includes living the virtues, right? So being just, being prudent, being temperate, and so on at work. But then beyond that, I'm seeing kind of even larger efforts. So for example, every year we host at the Bush School with a group called the Religious Freedom in Business Foundation, an annual Religious Freedom in Business conference where we have representatives from many of the Fortune 100 companies who run, who attempt to have, this started during the height of the sort of wokeness epidemic. A bunch of people of faith said, okay, we seem to have employee resource groups for every possible subgroup except religious ones. And they started to challenge management and say, hey, we want a Christian group. And management, oh, you can't have that. It's like, why not? Legally, why not? And quickly realized that they were on strong legal grounds to demand that. And so you had this expansion of these employee resource groups, and then they would gather every year on our campus to talk about best practices and so on, ways of protecting, allowing people to practice their faith at work. And then even bigger than that, I'm starting to see companies with CEOs who run the companies explicitly according to religious principles, in many cases Christian principles, even public companies. And the legal basis for this is quite sound now. And the important thing is not to make anybody feel like, hey, to work for us, you must be this type of Christian, for example, you must be Christian. But just to say, okay, my Christian faith as CEO leads me to act in these ways. And usually there are ways that, we want everybody to act. And so people like it a lot, and it seems to work a lot. I think this is a growing movement, and I hope to see a lot more of it and hope to encourage it as much as possible. So kind of those are three different levels, if you will, yeah.
Thank you very much. So you kind of were talking about the economic impact of virtue. Can you talk a little bit about the virtuous impact of acting like economically? Because it seems like in acting, a lot of times like in businesses, you're doing something, whether it's service for your customers or seeking to be wise, that's actually an area where you can see like virtue playing out. And so in seeking to act in an economic way, like when you approach it from the other direction, like what kind of results or what kind of things do we see?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It is interesting that in our society today, in many cases, businesses are the remaining human institution that forms people in virtue. Because families failing, many of them, the church attendance had declined, although it seems to be maybe turning. Schools, certainly, public schools certainly don't do this, And so for many people, the first time they learn orderliness is on their first job. They have to learn about showing up on time, dressing properly, and so on. So the discipline that comes with economic activity can form one in virtue. It's limited, though, because it's hard. This relates to your question before. If you don't even know that virtue exists and that you're growing in virtue, even though you have an opportunity to practice a particular virtue, if you don't even know it, you're not going to get very, very far, because you have to intend to be more courageous or to be more self-disciplined and so on, to be truly growing in virtue, right? So when you're trying to do this at work, you have to explain, okay, we're working on the habit of X, generosity, for example. We want to learn to be more generous in dealing with, in doing our customer service, for example. Unless people are aware that they're trying to grow in generosity, even if you get them to go through the motions of being generous, it's a very stunted and limited form of growth in virtue, if that makes sense. But it's a great opportunity. That's why I think that this research that shows that helping employees grow in virtue is good for business is the thing that we need to. Somebody had a question this morning in our academic session about you have to sell virtue to the employers and the employees. My background is not philosophy or psychology, it's in marketing. That's what I'm doing. I'm trying to sell virtue to business, right? And I think it's very saleable. Because it's consistent with, I think this is where your question is getting at, it's consistent with the idea of business, right? The business as enterprise, right? As problem solving, as service to others. It's entirely consistent with virtue. And that's, I think, what we have to try to point out.
Just piggyback on the comment before that, gentleman, when you mentioned that there are more companies now that are being run in a Christian manner or according to Judeo-Christian values. I believe earlier you mentioned that about 31% of the people are flourishing in their jobs. Has there ever been a legitimate study that would reflect people flourishing under the Judeo-Christian concept of management that you mentioned?
There are few, and none of this new wave of companies that I'm familiar with, although we are starting to plan that. The few that I've seen give you a sense, a positive direction, so that's encouraging. But the rest is just anecdotal, that it seems to be working. The employees seem to be happier, seem to be more productive. There's one investment firm that is actually investing its private equity based on this strategy alone. Now, the firm is called Sovereign's Capital, a fairly large company, and they invested in a number of companies that are led by Christians, and then have had some of them either go public or they've taken positions in public companies that are run by Christians in an overt way. The largest example of this, and the longest running that I'm aware of, is a company called Coca-Cola Consolidated. It's not Coke Inc., but they are the largest bottler of Coke Inc. in the United States, and one of the oldest. It's a family-run firm, family-controlled. They have public holdings as well, but it's family-controlled. And they are very explicitly Christian. One of the things that a lot of these companies have is a corporate chaplain. And the corporate chaplain's job is to minister to the employees. It's not to proselytize them, it's to minister to all of their needs, so emotional needs, bereavement needs, and so on. But it just so happens that in many cases, employees who come in as atheists become Christian when they see the love that the company is showing them, and they go, wow, if this is Christianity, I want more of it. And it is, right? And so yeah, very, very powerful stuff. Sovereign. Yeah.
There's a question.
Yes, I'm wondering if you can take us back to when you were at P&G and what the issues were there, what you were working on, and the development of what you've been sharing now when you were at Procter & Gamble.
So actually, Procter & Gamble and also my time at McKinsey, fortunately I had never anything to do with opioids. I was prior to that. that I was there. My experiences there all led me, in a sense, to this work. Procter & Gamble is when I was there in the 80s, long time ago. Dinosaurs roamed the earth. The way they treated people internally and the way everything was managed, I thought was a kind of strong people focus, a positive sense. But what I didn't like about it was the way we thought about the consumers. So, for example, we had a shampoo product. I won't name which one, and I remember I have colleagues working on that shampoo product. I was in the marketing department. They were in the marketing department, and their strategy was to convince the woman that she is her hair. Those were exactly their words. Convince that she is her hair. And how her hair is today is going to determine whether she's happy or sad. And I just thought, well, that's, okay, if you want an example of reductivism, there you have it, right? So I stayed there 4 years, and then I couldn't see making a career there. McKinsey was interesting there, and I've said this in print. So their biggest issue, I think this is why they got into the opioid trouble. They were very proud of their values, and their values were client first, firm second, self third. It's like, wow, very selfless. And they had this up on the walls and everything. It's like, very selfless. I'm happy to be part of such a noble organization where we place ourselves third. But the problem with client first means whatever the client wanted, the client got. If the client wanted to flood the country with opioids, then we'll do everything we can to flood the country with opioids with them. And there you have the mess that they got into. So there was no other check on sort of client first. So these experiences, one of my last assignments at McKinsey was I was about to be promoted and given a big new project with a very large bank. And my job, so just take a step back. My dad had been a banker all his life. He was a high school dropout who started working as a bank teller because the family needed money. Was very successful, got promoted, ended up becoming a bank president. So he's one of those rags to riches examples. This was on the small island of Malta where I grew up. We emigrated to Canada. He became a senior executive at an Italian bank in Canada, and at around age 55 was laid off in the middle of a recession with really no hope of ever getting a banking job again. And I saw what that did to him. By the grace of God, he recovered. He ran a couple of not-for-profits, and now he's about to turn 90 and has been a flourishing painter for the last 30 years. So happy, certainly a happy story. But in that time, I remember how awful it was, that experience for him. So this is a year later, I was told, okay, congratulations, we're going to promote you. You're going to have this huge study, this huge project, very, very important. You're going to go in and lay off 10,000 middle managers from this bank. Now, layoffs are sometimes necessary. I don't make any judgment on whether that case they were necessary or not, but having seen the human cost on my dad, and I'm about to do this times 10,000, was kind of like, ouch, you know. Did we help them beforehand to make those layoffs unnecessary, perhaps, you know? Anyway, I couldn't do it, I quit, and I went to study theology, thinking that maybe I had a calling to be a priest, and about 3 weeks in, I met Kathleen, and we've now been married 29 years. So yeah, but those experiences, I think, were very, very formative in terms of my work now. And in the Bush School, the faculty we hire, we try to make sure. So we have a design feature within the Bush School where we try to have a 50-50 balance between Ph.D. faculty and former executives in our full-time faculty. That's highly unusual in business schools. Usually you're mostly Ph.D.s. But even our PhD faculty, we like them to have had several years of actual business experience, because how can you teach business if you've never actually done it? You know, like who would want to go to med school with people who had never been doctors? You know what I mean? So the cruelest thing you can say to a business professor is, if you're so darn smart, why aren't you rich? And most of our faculty are rich. You know, they just made a lot of money. They continue to make money as faculty, and they teach because they love it, and they'd rather spend their time doing that. So I think it's certainly a really good business model for me. It keeps my salary budget low. I have one faculty, this is the most extreme, one faculty member, I pay him 5% each year of what he made the year before he came to work for us. And he loves the work, and we love having him, and he's good for our students. Anyway, I probably digressed way beyond your question and used up all of our time. Great, thank you.
Thank you for coming. I'd like to remind you, please turn in your name tags on the way out, and please fill out the survey. There will be, I think, shortly a QR code on the screen. There's also one in the program for that. 2 upcoming events I'd like to tell you about. The first is next week. It's the annual Callahan Lecture, which celebrates this year's Michael Novak Award winner, which is Dr. Kirsten Anderson-Berghog. That'll be out at Hope College, and she's actually here today, so I think we have, it's like Novak winners all the way down, as they say. And finally, Acton University this summer, June 22nd through 25th. Registration is now open. There's currently early bird pricing. There's a group rate available. I often hear people say, I've thought about going to Acton University for years. This should be your year. Like, what are you waiting for? So wanted to tell you about that. And again, you're welcome to stay if you'd like to hear some of those academic papers. We have our Character, Commerce, and Human Flourishing conference going on as we speak, sponsored by our Journal of Markets and Morality. Thank you for coming.